Ho ho, etc. And welcome to this special holiday episode of And Now They Sing, releasing after Christmas because I was in a rehearsal process for all of November and early December, eating up my writing and editing time. But here in the lame duck week of 2020, I wanted to take one final look at one of my favorite holiday traditions, the Nutcracker. Because I want to talk about how completely strange this tradition is. The Nutcracker is one of those cultural milestones that we've all collectively decided to just accept without thinking too hard about it. Like the Muppets or Marina Abramovich. It's the only piece of holiday media that's a ballet, and conversely, it's the only ballet associated with a specific holiday. And further than that, it's the only ballet that nearly every ballet company in the country produces every single season. Talk about the overabundance of Don Quixote or Giselle all you want, nothing comes close to the Nutcracker. There's a reason that English dance critic Richard Buckle began his 1972 review of the Royal Ballet's Nutcracker with, "Well, we are one more Nutcracker nearer death." And while the push to repeat the Nutcracker annually is at this point a financial consideration, the San Francisco Ballet and the New York City Ballet both rely on Nutcracker ticket sales for around 40% of their annual budgets. There's no denying the emotional attachment, as explained by dance scholar Jennifer Fisher in her book Nutcracker Nation. One of the more revealing questions I asked Toronto professionals was, if you could eliminate the Nutcracker from the repertoire, would you? What if, magically, your company had all the money in the world and no need to raise more? Would you then eliminate the Nutcracker? Life without the Nutcracker? Enticing, but only for a moment. Almost none of the dancers I talked to wanted to see the ballet disappear, sometimes surprising even themselves with that decision. So in this year where the unthinkable has occurred and hundreds of Nutcrackers have been cancelled or moved online, let's take a look at how this tradition began. Because keep in mind, the United States is the only country that does this. Yes, companies like the Royal Ballet in London or Melbourne's Ballet Australia have annual Nutcrackers. But even in Russia, where it premiered, the ballet doesn't have the same cultural omnipresence as it has in the States. There's no single reason for this, but my goal today is to talk about one of the central figures of this phenomenon. This is a story of how choreographer George Balanchine helped the Nutcracker conquer America. The Nutcracker first came to America not as a ballet, but as a concert piece. After the premiere of the ballet in 1893 was met with middling reviews, composer Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky took 8 of the themes from the score and repackaged them as the Nutcracker Suite, which became much more popular in the first half of the 20th century. If you've ever wondered why this Russian trepak reminds you of the holidays, but this similar piece doesn't evoke the same feeling, it's because only the former was included in the suite. Most of the themes you know are here: the Spanish Chocolate, the reed flutes, the opening Soldier March, and the famous Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy. While the Nutcracker Suite was popular, it wasn't the sort of music that every household in America could hum, but that began to change in 1940, when a group of animators found the Nutcracker Suite in a record shop and built an animated sequence around the score, as part of the film Fantasia. It's notable to point out that at the time that Disney animated the Nutcracker sequence, the score had no direct association to Christmas. Yes, the ballet took place during the holiday, but it wasn't a Christmas ballet any more than, say, Little Women is a Christmas novel.
Merry Christmas, girls! Mommy! Oh, Merry Christmas!
In fact, when the original ballet premiered in St. Petersburg, it premiered in February. And along with that, the first full production of the Nutcracker in America came about 1 month before the premiere of Fantasia, in October 1940. While American ballet companies had presented selections from the Nutcracker before, the first full performance on American soil was given by a touring company, the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo. The production was restaged by Alexandra Fedorova, using much of the original 1893 choreography by Marius Pepita and Lev Ivanov, though the scale of the production was drastically reduced to allow for touring. The production premiered in New York before touring the rest of the United States. One of the audience members who became enthralled with this tour was Willem Christensen, founder and artistic director of the San Francisco Ballet. Christensen had already performed select scenes from the ballet with the company as early as 1935, but after watching the full version, he began planning his own version of the ballet, which was to be the first full production choreographed by American artists. To help him in his development, Christensen enlisted 2 members of the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo to guide him. One was principal ballerina Alexandra Danilova, the other was ballet master George Balanchine. George Balanchine was, like the Nutcracker, born in St. Petersburg. At the age of 9, his father had pushed both him and his sister into dance classes. Although he was initially hesitant to join, he quickly rose up the ranks of the Imperial Ballet Academy and began to perform with the Mariinsky Ballet, Russia's state-sponsored center for classical dance, and the company who had premiered the Nutcracker 9 years before Balanchine was born. Over the years, Balanchine performed in the Nutcracker multiple times, as an ensemble mouse, as the Mouse King, as a Russian hoop dancer, and as the Nutcracker and Prince himself. By the time he graduated from Petrograd Conservatory in 1923, his childhood was fundamentally tied up in the Nutcracker. Balanchine moved to Paris in 1924 and quickly joined the Ballet Russe, which is different than the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo. See, the original Ballet Russe was run by impresario Sergei Diaghilev, who died in 1929, whereupon the group splintered before reforming as the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo, which subsequently fired Balanchine and then collapsed and reformed again. Honestly, the story of the various Ballet Russe could be their own video, so I'm moving on. Point is, in the 1930s, Balanchine floated to various ballet companies worldwide, choreographing new dances and slowly developing his signature style. His dances were often shorter, with much simpler costume and scenic design, in order to force audiences to focus on the movement of the performers, a style that was eventually given the name neoclassical. Balanchine opened the School of American Ballet in New York in 1933 to teach the neoclassical style to American dancers. But eventually Balanchine did return to the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo as ballet master, and was present on that original 1940 tour. Not as a performer, mind, just as artistic leadership. Balanchine had suffered a knee injury in 1928 and rarely performed after that point. But his position in the company and familiarity with the Nutcracker growing up brought him into the room as Willem Christensen prepared to choreograph the San Francisco Ballet version. At Balanchine and Danilova's insistence, Christensen opted not to mimic the original production, but to make his own, and made small alterations to the structure of the ballet while keeping the score intact. For example, there's a long segment of the ballet between the death of the Mouse King, spoiler alert, and the snowflake dance that closes Act 1. While Pepita and Ivanov had left this section undanced, Christensen added 2 new characters for a pas de deux in the space, the Snow King and Queen. While Nutcracker purists may decry their inclusion, it was the first in a trend of American productions which include their duet to this day. The Christensen production was also the first to fundamentally mark the ballet as Christmas entertainment, premiering on Christmas Eve 1944 and drawing a connection between the Act 2 Land of Sweets and the American associations of Christmas as a time of candy canes and sugar plums. A happy coincidence considering that Russian ideas of Christmas don't have the same associations. Christensen revived the piece in 1949 and then again in 1950, and proceeded to continue staging it each year, transforming the ballet from another piece in the repertoire into a holiday tradition. But by the time that Christensen was redefining the Nutcracker's place in the holiday season, George Balanchine had already moved on to his own company, who would eventually stage his own version of the ballet. Balanchine had resisted choreographing Nutcracker earlier in his career because of his insistence on scale. In direct opposition to his neoclassical work, his view was that the Nutcracker wouldn't be true to the original if not staged with a significant budget and design to match. Even as he advised the relatively young San Francisco Ballet on their production, he had concerns that their Nutcracker wouldn't match the scale of the Mariinsky designs. So it took him 5 years after the founding of the New York City Ballet in 1948 to make the call that the company was prepared to stage the Nutcracker to his specifications. This actually remains an element of the ballet's aura to this day. For a young company to be able to pull off the Nutcracker successfully, with its large cast and multiple scenic changes, is a mark of having made it as a company, in addition to a milestone of financial stability since, you can now add Nutcracker ticket sales to your budget. And even in 1953, as plans began to form for Balanchine's Nutcracker, he ran into problems with the space. The New York City Ballet was, at the time, resident at the City Center for Music and Dance, which had a relatively small stage that couldn't match the scale of the Mariinsky. Still, the scenic design from Robert Armistead and costumes by Karinska certainly did their best to mimic the grandeur as best they could. When the board of the NYC Ballet initially gave Balanchine a budget of $40,000 for the Nutcracker, Balanchine proceeded to spend $25,000 on the tree alone, a massive structure splitting into two halves that would rise simultaneously to give the impression that the tree was growing higher. When Morton Baum, chairman of the city center, objected to the tree, Balanchine replied, "The Nutcracker is the tree." Balanchine made other changes to, as he advised Christensen, make the ballet his own. He removed the Snow King and Queen and returned to the Mariinsky focus on giving child actors a chance to shine. As student actors traditionally don't play more than one role in a given performance, the Balanchine Nutcracker involves more than 100 student performers annually. Balanchine also added a soloist to the Waltz of the Flowers named Dewdrop, and changed the name of the lead girl. See, the Nutcracker claims to have been adapted from E.T.A. Hoffmann's 1816 story The Nutcracker and the Mouse King, but that's technically untrue. The basis for the scenario was actually an 1844 rewrite of the story by Alexandre Dumas' Père, titled The Story of a Nutcracker. The lead girl in that rewrite, and in the Nutcracker since, was named Clara. However, in Hoffmann's story, Clara is actually the name of a doll owned by the lead character, not the lead herself. Balanchine returned to the Hoffmann story and gave his lead girl her original name, Marie. The only changes to the score were to move the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy from the end of Act 2 closer to the beginning of the act, and to add one piece of Tchaikovsky music, an Act 1 violin feature that was originally written as the entr'acte to The Sleeping Beauty, but features a melodic idea that would later get reused in the Nutcracker. Beyond these small adjustments, Balanchine's Nutcracker was marked by attempts to be faithful to the original production he had grown up with. While the choreography was new, the story kept completely true to the original, wholesome, family-friendly, and especially fitting to the emotion of the holiday. Almost immediately upon debut in February 1954, the ballet was hugely successful, helping to stabilize the NYC Ballet budget with ticket sales and becoming, starting in 1955, a holiday tradition. Much like Balanchine had done in St. Petersburg, students of the School of the American Ballet can spend their childhood growing up in the Nutcracker, changing roles from year to year and making the transition from the bunny to party guests to polichinelles to soldiers, up to the role of Bed, the dancer who crawls under Marie's magically moving bed to move it around the stage. The success was further bolstered by two televised performances of the ballet. The first, in 1957, was presented on CBS as part of the anthology series The Seven Lively Arts, which was basically a proto-Great Performances. As the time slot was only 60 minutes, the performance was drastically reduced, cutting much of the intro and many of the Act 2 divertisements. Performed in black and white, it was also notable for featuring George Balanchine himself stepping in as Drosselmeyer, one of his only filmed performances. The broadcast was so successful that it was repeated the following year, as part of the program Playhouse 90, whose 90-minute runtime meant fewer cuts had to be made. It was also presented in color and can be found in full on YouTube. These two broadcasts were not only a boost in publicity for the less than 10-year-old ballet company, but a huge boost in the popularity of the Nutcracker. It was the first time any version of the ballet had ever been televised, which meant for many Americans, especially those who didn't often attend the ballet, it was their first time seeing the story performed at all. It also kicked off a tradition of television performances for the Balanchine Nutcracker. While the full ballet was only ever broadcast live one other time, this broadcast was rerun for many years, and the company often performed excerpts from the ballet on talk shows and variety shows. This continues today, with the most recent being the 2020 Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, where principal dancer Ashley Bowder performed the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy on one of the socially distanced floats. But after 10 years of Nutcracker performances at the City Center, a move to another venue would give Balanchine the long-postponed opportunity to truly realize his Mariinsky-scale dreams. So here's a fun fact. The buildings of the Lincoln Center Concourse were originally constructed for the 1964 New York World's Fair. When the Lincoln Center Theater took possession of the theater spaces after the fair ended in the fall, they began looking for deserving arts organizations who would benefit from the institutional support of being resident companies there. For one of the buildings, the New York State Theater, renamed the David H. Koch Theater in 2008, the Lincoln Center selected 3 companies to share the space: the New York City Opera, the American Ballet Theater, and the New York City Ballet. And because of the timing of the fair ending, it meant that one of the first large-scale productions to perform in the theater would be George Balanchine's Nutcracker. This led to brand new scenic designs by Ruben Ter-Aratunian and revised costume designs by Karinska, which, due to budget as well as more space in the theater, were able to finally match the Mariinsky in scale. The tree was also overhauled, replacing the version split in two halves with the still-in-use 41-foot monster. Also, because the theater was new, Balanchine lobbied to cut a massive hole at the back of the stage so the tree could rise from the ground. The hole remains to this day, and in the almost 60 years since the ballet moved to the space, has never been used for any other purpose by the NYC Ballet except for this one tree effect. Smaller adjustments were also made to content, including an overhaul of the Arabian coffee dance, which replaced a male soloist with a female one, and the addition of these ball fan accessories for the snowflakes, a direct copy-paste of the Marinsky designs. And the resulting re-premiere of the revised Balanchine got even better reviews than before. Over the next 20 years, until his death in 1983, George Balanchine continued to revise the production, adding little effects here and there. The most famous was the 1968 edition of the sliding releve effect, where, well, just watch. At the Marinsky, this effect was achieved by the Sugar Plum Fairy standing on a scarf pulled by her cavalier. At the NYC Ballet, the trick remains a small tin plate, pulled across on a wire by a stagehand. The New York City Ballet is quite proud that not one of the effects in the show are automated. The tree is pulled by stagehands with a counterweight, the bed is someone crawling around, the tumbler used to dispense the snow is spun by stagehands, the list goes on. In the wake of the huge success of the Balanchine production, other companies began to take note of the Nutcracker. Not just that the ballet was popular, but that the ballet provided a perfect gateway to bring new audiences to the ballet for the first time, and to bring the ballet into people's holiday celebrations. Theater had countless productions of A Christmas Carol, television had reruns of A Charlie Brown Christmas and It's a Wonderful Life, and ballet now had the Nutcracker. One of the earliest productions to follow the Balanchine was the Atlanta Ballet, who literally followed it. In 1959, Atlanta became the first company to license Balanchine's choreography, having members of the NYC Ballet travel down to Atlanta to instruct them in how the production should be staged. While the designs were the company's own, Balanchine did have to sign off on them, as the Balanchine Trust does to this day when companies license the choreography. Other companies took different routes. Some, like Washington Ballet, Milwaukee Ballet, or Colorado Ballet, developed their own productions, with the artistic directors or guest artists stepping in to choreograph. Others licensed productions from fellow companies. Ballet West staged Willem Christensen's version, while the Pacific Northwest Ballet revived a version by his brother, Lou Christensen. The most famous non-Balanchine version is likely the 1976 production at the American Ballet Theater, which was also televised in 1977 and replayed in reruns until 1991. This production was choreographed by ABT principal dancer and 28-year-old white-hot talent Mikhail Baryshnikov, the first choreographer to dance in the premiere of his own Nutcracker. The Baryshnikov version contained many firsts for the ballet, many of which were copied by subsequent productions. I'll run down a quick list right now. First to include Drosselmeyer in Act 2. First to cut the Sugar Plum Fairy entirely. First to cut Mother Ginger. First to cut all the child dancers. First to open with a scene in Drosselmeyer's workshop where he builds the Nutcracker. First to have a random party guest break the Nutcracker instead of Fritz. First to make the Arabian dance a duet rather than a solo. First to have Clara and the Prince dance the pas de deux instead of the Sugar Plum Fairy and Cavalier. First to replace the Snow King and Queen with another Clara and Prince duet. First to add Clara and Prince to the Waltz of the Flowers. Yeah, did I mention that Baryshnikov danced the role of the Prince? But even during that stretch of time, the Balanchine version continued its dominance over American companies. Among the many groups who licensed Balanchine's Nutcracker, or to give it its full legal name, George Balanchine's The Nutcracker, were Stanford City Ballet, Pittsburgh Ballet Theater, Miami City Ballet, American Ballet East, Los Angeles Ballet, Alabama Ballet, Oregon Ballet Theater, and Ballet Chicago. Added to this list is the curious case of the Pennsylvania Ballet, which in 1968 licensed only Act 2 of the Balanchine, subbing in their own Act 1 choreography. They performed this strange hybrid for 20 years before switching to the full Balanchine in 1987, which they perform to this day. The omnipresence of the Balanchine came to its apex in 1993, when the New York City Ballet production was formally filmed and released in movie theaters. The resulting film was not well received by ballet fans.
After Godfather Drosselmeyer put his magical dancing dolls back in their boxes, he brought out toys for the children. She dreamed of her own dear Nutcracker and his sad fate.
The narration by Kevin Kline is cloying and repetitive, the cinematography often lands on strange close-ups, and the stunt casting of non-dancer Macaulay Culkin as the Nutcracker Prince is certainly a choice. My favorite part is the battle scene when the Nutcracker first appears as a performer. In the real show, the Nutcracker has this large mask to, look like a Nutcracker. But if we cover Macaulay Culkin's head, people won't know it's Macaulay Culkin, so here he just gets some makeup. Yep. Really looking like a Nutcracker there. Anyway, this version is on YouTube for free, check it out. The point being, by the early 1990s, George Balanchine's vision of what the Nutcracker looked like was coded into the brains of most American ballet audiences. Even if the version they watched each year wasn't choreographed by him, though there was a better chance on average that it was, the productions generally followed the blueprint he had laid out. The plot was consistent, though most productions retained the name Clara rather than Marie, and the variations in the scenic design rarely aimed to place the story in anywhere other than the ambiguous European setting from the Mariinsky debut. But, as with all artistic trends, with that kind of omnipresence comes a backlash, and nothing cemented the reputation of the Balanchine as the standard Nutcracker than the wave of productions that began to slowly break away from the standard it set. A note before we begin. One of the recurring trends with local productions of the Nutcracker nationwide is for each company to include a touch of local flavor in their productions. Some may change a few plot points, while others may overhaul entire narrative threads. This list of avant-garde Nutcrackers is not comprehensive, but merely a smattering of some of the better known. To start, we'll actually jump back a bit. In 1983, Kent Stowell, artistic director of Seattle's Pacific Northwest Ballet, created his own Nutcracker, with the help of famed children's book author Maurice Sendak. Sendak was initially very against the idea of designing a Nutcracker, but relented when Stowell voiced his intent to return to the original E.T.A. Hoffman story for inspiration. Thus, the Stowell-Sendak production was darker in tone than other Nutcrackers, not only with the more stylized set and costume designs from Sendak, but also in having a second act set not in a land of sweets, but in a seraglio at dusk. And full disclosure, I grew up on this version and I am entirely biased. One of the elements that Stowell added from the Hoffman text was a story within the story called The Hard Nut. The narrative, told to Marie by Drosselmeyer, is a story that explains how the prince became a Nutcracker, a story that gets referenced in a short added pantomime during the Act 1 party scene. And hey, speaking of The Hard Nut, Mark Morris premiered his take on the Nutcracker in Brussels, yes, but the artists were American and the production toured America since 1993, so it counts here. On top of the 1960s mod designs for the production, Morris tossed out the entire second act plot, replacing it with a fairly straightforward retelling of The Hard Nut, thus the changed title. As such, The Hard Nut is the only Nutcracker to include both a Mouse King and a Mouse Queen, the only one where Marie's mother leads the Dance of the Flowers, and, fascinatingly, one of the only versions to play the entire Tchaikovsky score in the correct order and with no additions from other works. A move that would not be followed by Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn's 1960 reorchestration of the Nutcracker suite only covered 9 of the tracks from the original ballet. So, when choreographer Donald Byrd decided to make Ellington and Strayhorn's album the basis for his radically reimagined Nutcracker, he hired David Berger, one of the country's greatest authorities on Strayhorn's arrangements, to compose the remainder of the music. The Harlem Nutcracker sprung from Byrd's desire to create a Nutcracker for black audiences, which would follow the story of a black family. Clara was older, a widow celebrating her first Christmas after her husband's passing. The magic of the Nutcracker coming to life was reframed as her recalling her past life with him, traveling to the rollicking club suites in Act 2. It's also, and spoiler warning for this next part, the only version where Clara dies in the end. So, there's that. While not every company went so far afield from the Balanchine model as these three did, many of the companies who originally staged more traditional Nutcrackers began to steadily replace those productions with more radically reimagined versions. The first major production to move this setting from Europe to America was the 1987 production at the Joffrey Ballet. In the early 2000s, San Francisco Ballet, Washington Ballet, and Milwaukee Ballet all saw new productions that followed suit, shifting the setting to America and adjusting core elements of the plot, such as how the Mouse King died, or which siblings travel to the Land of Sweets, or how badass Drosselmeyer's entrance is. The last decade has seen even more variation, such that it becomes difficult to determine what technically counts as a production of the Nutcracker anymore. From the ballet-free adaptation performed by the House Theater of Chicago, to the touring production of the hip-hop Nutcracker, to the various burlesque shows nationwide with names like the Butt Cracker or the Slut Cracker, both real names of more than one show in more than one city. As of 2019, there are now 8 companies that continue to license George Balanchine's The Nutcracker. 2 of them are international, the Royal Danish Ballet since 2011, and Italy's Teatro alla Scala since 2018. The remaining 6 are in the US: NYC Ballet, Pennsylvania Ballet, Miami City Ballet, Alabama Ballet, Oregon Ballet Theater, and the most recent, the aforementioned Pacific Northwest Ballet. In ditching the Stowell Sendak version and switching to the Balanchine choreography in 2015, PNB is the only major ballet company to replace their own homegrown version of the Nutcracker with a revival of the Balanchine version. The reasoning for doing so was the Balanchine choreography being more challenging for their dancers, although they did follow Sendak's lead in selecting children's book author Ian Falconer of the Olivia books for the new designs, which is fine. It's fine. It's fine. I'm not bitter. This is not me being biased. It's fine. Of course, the original production at the New York City Ballet, the longest running without interruption in the world, remains the most popular and most widely known single production. It has since been televised again for PBS's Live at Lincoln Center series in 2011, which was finally released on DVD in 2016. Even in this unorthodox year, the company is keeping the show alive for audiences by streaming a 2019 recording of the production online, with promises to be back at Lincoln Center in person in 2021. In many ways, the appeal of the New York City Ballet's Nutcracker is now the inverse of what it was when it premiered in 1954. At the time, it was a revitalized version of a relatively obscure ballet, staged by a choreographer well respected in his industry but less well known beyond it. Nowadays, the legacy of George Balanchine's The Nutcracker long precedes it, and as such, the appeal of the NYC Ballet production lies, at least partially, in seeing how the Nutcracker craze began, before decades of plot adjustments and stylized sets and the growing omnipresence of the score. It's not enough for a production of The Nutcracker to simply be The Nutcracker, not at a time when every company seems to have its own spin on the ballet. Even the other licensed productions of the Balanchine choreography have subtle changes, if only visual, to make them distinct from the crowd. In that respect, the original New York City Ballet Nutcracker is remarkable in its unremarkability, for being, even today, the mold by which other Nutcrackers are measured, either in fidelity or in deviation. Its impact, and the impact of George Balanchine, on the American obsession with this one particular ballet cannot be overstated. So, whether you hate the Nutcracker with the passion of 1,000 Mouse Kings, or find the holiday season just isn't complete without the ringing of the Celeste and the Sugar Plum Fairies solo, you know where to direct your ire. Or, in my own case, who to be thankful for.